Hi, and welcome to the very first edition of CAP Talks Back, a series of video podcasts from the CAP community sharing their professional knowledge with the wider business community. And why wouldn't we? So let's get stuck straight in today because we're very lucky. We've got the lovely Cheryl Barnes from Cosmic Teapot with us. Cheryl has many talents in the world of health and well-being, but today we're going to be talking about stress and more specifically about the importance of stress management. So Cheryl, welcome to CAP Talks Back.
Thanks, Paul. It's absolutely lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're British. We should have a stiff upper lip and, stress. Maybe we just got to suck it up and get on with it.
With stress, yeah, it's interesting. I think there is. It's very difficult with stress. There's two very different types of stress. And I think when we're talking about stress, it's really important to kind of think about the two different types. So one is acute stress, which is kind of stuff that comes up where maybe living a relatively normal life and on a day-to-day basis, stressors can happen. And then we have this, how do we handle stress in an immediate kind of moment that comes out of nowhere? And that kind of often falls into stuff that most of us have heard of, kind of like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So something happens and we'll kind of either go into a aggressive kind of territorial reaction or we'll want to run away. And that's acute stress. And that kind of is the kind of thing that arguably we should be able to handle a bit of acute stress. And actually stress is good for us. You know, if we get into a stressful place, sometimes it's where magic can happen, kind of outside of our comfort zone. And it's good to kind of push ourselves a little bit. But where stress becomes a problem and where stress is something that, maybe we might find it harder to handle and it becomes a bit of a different thing, is chronic stress. And that's really when we're talking about stress management and a need to proactively manage stress, especially in the workplace. Chronic stress is really what we're talking about. And that's when people are experiencing stress, uncontrollable stress, day in, day out. And especially if that stress is coming from work and from home, and maybe there's financial pressures, maybe there's family issues going on. And so somebody almost isn't getting any break from stress. Everywhere they turn, life is stressful. And that's difficult. That's difficult to manage. And that is a different thing entirely to acute stress and everyday small or minor stress.
Okay. So in the world of business, if you've got an employee and he's very stressed, he may be just stressed at home, maybe not at work, they could have problems, marital problems, or the children, money problems, as you just said, which a lot of people do. Whose responsibility, the employer or the employee?
That's a really interesting question, actually, Paul. And I have this conversation quite a bit, actually, with employers. It's kind of, because there is always, there's the health and safety kind of like rules around like where is the employer's responsibility. And there is a duty of care on employers to manage health, safety, and welfare. And actually, it's literally specified in I think it's the 1974 Health and Safety Act, that employers do have a duty of care for health, safety, and welfare of their employees. But if this stress is coming from a home situation, is it that employer's responsibility to help the employee with their stress? But I think the thing here is that it doesn't really matter where the stress is coming from. Any employee that's suffering a lot with stress, whether it's marital, financial problems, or whether it is actually the job they're doing and what they're facing every day in their kind of work environment, regardless of where the stress is coming from, if they're stressed, they are going to be less effective. And I mean, research goes all the way back to the 1970s, kind of like showing how when we're under stress or when we're stressed, we make less good decisions. Our cognitive processes are really affected. Things like memory can be really, really adversely affected if we're under lots of consistent and ongoing stress. So it doesn't really matter what the source of the stress is, whether it's a home source or whether it's a work source. It's kind of in the employer's best interests to help the employee manage their own stress. And something else that I find interesting in this one is that if we've got a stressed employee, so one stressed employee comes in, stress is actually kind of a bit contagious. And so if you've got one employee who's coming in feeling stressed, agitated, they're kind of like just maybe even whinging about what's going on at home or whatever, that will be bringing the other people around them down, and it will be affecting the energy in the work environment. And so actually that one employee who's stressed could actually be the trigger for somebody else to become stressed. Even just having to go into work and face that person sat across the desk who is stressed could result in them becoming stressed. And I think the other thing that I really like is that if we manage stress at an organizational level, we give a common language. It kind of, if we address stress as an employer and we help all of our employees with stress management, there becomes like a common language or a common understanding around stress. That actually, if you expect an employee to deal with it by themselves, they're going to go off and do this course or that course, and they're going to be talking slightly different perspectives on stress. So if an employer takes control of it and says, I'm going to help all of my employees with some stress management techniques, then yeah, it can really, really help across the board. And you've got happy employees, they're all happier, they're all less stressed, and they're all then going to perform more effectively.
I think you answered that rather well.
Thank you.
So reactive versus proactive, what's the benefits of the latter?
Okay, so often what happens is we wait till somebody comes to HR and says, I'm really stressed, I can't handle my workload, or I've got problems at home and I'm really in a bit of a crisis point. Or we wait till somebody rings up and says, I'm not coming into work today, I'm really stressed. The difficulty then is that once people have got that stressed, I mean, and again, there's a lot of research that shows when people are that stressed, they've already become more territorial, paranoid, a little bit aggressive even. And so trying to help somebody who's already at that level of stress that they're having to report into HR, they're already quite hard to handle, and they're already struggling to handle themselves. So if we wait until it's already got to the point that they're reporting stress, we've kind of left it too late, really. And there's also something else as well with this one, which is that stress doesn't always present as stress. And so like there's a whole bunch of other stuff that kind of is caused by stress. So headaches, insomnia, IBS. So often people don't report stress. They're just like, oh, I'm not sleeping very well, I'm really tired, or I've got a really bad headache again, or my stomach isn't feeling well, I'm going to have to stay off work because I've got digestive issues, or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's kind of like stress is a difficult thing. If we wait for people to report stress, they've usually already gone through a whole bunch of other symptoms that are already affecting them and already causing problems. So proactively coming in and giving everybody some tools to manage stress before they get stressed prevents all of these kind of symptoms coming up, and actually stops them getting to the point where it's really hard to handle. And something else is that people who go off with stress, they go off on average for about 23.9 days. I know that's quite a precise number, but that's almost 5 weeks that people go off for. And if you think about, yes, a long time, a critical employee in your organization, someone else having to pick up their emails for that length of time, any ongoing projects, people they're managing, it becomes really tricky. And actually there's an awful lot of people who don't come back, and actually stress overtook cancer way back in 2011. Stress overtook cancer as the main reason for long-term absence from work. And it's about 40% of work-related illness, again, back from about 2011, is due to stress. Wow. 40% of work-related long-term absence due to stress. So yeah, it's definitely worth taking a proactive approach and just helping everybody across the board.
No, that's a really good point. What causes stress in the first place? Why do we get stressed?
Yeah, so often we think that stress is a mental thing, and it's all to do with that kind of the amount of stuff that we're thinking about. But actually, stress stress can come from any one of a number of different sources. And so I like to think of us as holistic beings. That's like a phrase that people have often heard about. But yeah, we have physical inputs, we have mental inputs, we have emotional inputs, things that kind of we do. So even the foods that we eat can actually be a stressor. So if we're eating, poor nutrition foods, foods that don't have a lot of kind of vitamins and nutrients.
What about chocolate? What about chocolate?
Some chocolate can be good. Some chocolate can be good, although, we're all individual and everybody's different. And so, chocolate, if it makes you feel good, Paul, then that's probably not a bad thing. And providing you're getting some spinach in your diet and some other good things to kind of like help boost you. But yeah, I think for me, I think there's a model called the 6 pillars of health. And so when I'm dealing with people who are stressed, I kind of take them through looking at kind of how much exercise they're getting, what their quality of sleep is like, what they're eating, whether they're taking any supplements like vitamin D during the winter to help with that kind of sunshine boost, how much time they spend on their own, kind of like just literally reflecting and not doing anything or trying to achieve anything, and then socializing as well with people outside of work and outside of family. It's just so good for us to chat things through, have a bit of a laugh, have a bit of a nice time with people. And if we're not getting that, if we're not getting good food, good sleep, good nutrition, we're not getting time by ourselves, we're not socializing, it can all add up to us becoming more stressed. And so, yeah, it's not always just the mental stuff. It can be a combination of things. And actually, by improving our nutrition, getting better exercise, and actually getting oxygen into our system is really good for stress, because when we kind of get stressed, we go into kind of like the fight or flight stuff, which is associated with the sympathetic nervous system, which actually stops a lot of basic processes. Our breathing gets shallower, our digestion gets impacted and things like that. So yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you some basic advice for managing stress, but I think there was a whole heap of it in there. But you also touched on something else. We're social creatures. It's very important to us. And how has that affected people over the last year? Because I think stress has come to the forefront because we've had over a year now where things aren't quite as normal. And a lot of people have been isolated for a long time.
Yeah. There have been a lot of studies, and I think it's one of the stats I heard is something like 64% of us have felt more stressed since March 2020, when the first kind of lockdown measures came in. And it's things to do, things like disconnection, so feeling disconnected from other people, a general lack of control, and just generally being quite fearful around, what the future might bring. And yeah, I mean, lack of control is a really, really important thing in stress. And there's actually a type of depression called learned helplessness, which if stress carries on for a long time, we get to that point that we almost feel like we have no control over our life. It doesn't really matter what we do. It's always going to be terrible. And I think there's been a lot of that increasing over this time. And yeah, what was the other stat I heard? I think it was, the Mental Health Foundation. They said something like 75% of adults have said that over the last 12 months, over the last year, they have got to a point where their stress has been either incredibly overwhelming or it's led to them feeling totally out of control. So 74% of adults have said that over that 12-month period, they've got to that kind of level of overwhelm or out of control. And this is going back to the beginning of our chat earlier about that. This is the chronic stress. This is chronic, everyday, day in, day out stress, when things like, and it sounds a bit silly, but whether you can get toilet rolls, whether you're going to be able to buy enough toilet rolls to have in the house. I mean, do you remember all of that back at the beginning? There were
some great funny videos about that as well. And instead of being a drug dealer, they kind of had toilet rolls tucked up.
Yeah.
Cars were pulling up, and it was really funny.
But when you are a parent and you've got children to feed and you've got all of this and you don't even know what's going to happen with your job. And I mean, the government, the furlough schemes and everything else have been really, really helpful, and some of the grants. Some people haven't been as lucky as others with some of that, but regardless of who you are, pretty much, I don't think anybody has not experienced some kind of lockdown, pandemic-related stress this year. So a lot of the figures I quote are kind of like from a little bit further back. But I think even in 2016, I think we'd increased from 2011, we'd got up to about 45% of work-related absence was due to stress. And that was before all of this. So we can only really kind of imagine just kind of like how stressed people are. And then we think about teachers and we think about NHS frontline workers, and, you know, their levels of stress have increased exponentially. So, yeah, it's been a tough year for everyone, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Cheryl, your passion for helping people just shines through. It sticks out a mile. But what's your background with stress?
Oh, so yeah, I mean, I think I've always been fascinated by the human psyche. I find human beings interesting, and I think even from a young child, you know, it sounds. My mum used to tell stories about how we'd go to a restaurant and the waiter would be really kind of like grumpy, and I'd almost make it my mission as like a 12-year-old girl to kind of like make him laugh by the end of the meal. And so, yeah, I've always found, you know, why are people stressed? Why do some people carry stress so well and other people don't carry it well? And I actually started off doing a geography degree, but found it incredibly tedious, and swapped to psychology because it has been a lifelong interest. And so, yeah, I found it so fascinating. I got a first. I spent a lot of my time in the medical library. I mean, I think sometimes people think psychology is a bit of a namby-pamby kind of degree, but not at all. I mean, I was in the medical library for hours researching it all, and stress and anxiety disorders were what I kind of majored in. And that's what I did my dissertation on, was kind of stress and the impacts of stress. And then after that, I went into the corporate world. And so I've got kind of 15, 20 years, depending on when you kind of like draw the line, in kind of like corporate management, a lot of it. So I was doing sales, business development, all of which is pretty kind of stressful with targets and all of that, in the IT industry. Yeah, all sorts of different places. But so, yeah, a lot of professional experience of stress, my own, but also towards the end of my corporate career, I was managing other people. So at one point I was managing 3 departments, 18 people. And actually out of that, you know, there was almost not a day went by that somebody wasn't stressed, you know. And if it wasn't one of my employees, it was me or my manager, somebody would have been stressed. And so learning to manage my own stress around other people's stress, helping myself with my own stress, and then helping other people with their stress, that became kind of part of the job, really. And all of that I was kind of doing whilst having 2 young children. I went through a divorce, so I had personal stress. So there was kind of the theory from university, then there was the professional experience, and then also alongside that personal experience. But yeah, I mean, they say that you go into things that kind of you have experience with, and I have been incredibly stressed, you know, throughout my, you know, during my life, I have had some very stressful times. And people often say to me now, so what, you don't experience stress anymore? And it's like, no, not at all. I still experience stress. I just now have tools and techniques that I can pretty quickly access. And so I'll notice my stress rising, and it's kind of almost like a traffic light system. You kind of go from green to like a light amber to a darker amber to a red till, you know, the steam is coming out of your ears point. And I'm just good now at kind of, once I'm at light amber, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm starting to get a bit wound up. Let's take some deep breaths. Let's get some oxygen to the brain, either by, you know, deep breaths gets oxygen into the lungs, which goes into the bloodstream from there, or drinking. I've got here a glass of water. Is another way of getting oxygen into the brain, because it's H2O. And so, yeah, drinking that goes through the stomach lining and into the bloodstream and up to the brain. And oxygen in the brain it really, really helps us to manage stress. So, yeah, I get stressed. I don't think, everybody gets stressed, you know, unless you're the Buddha and you spend your life kind of meditating in a cave. Pretty much everybody gets stressed. It's how we manage it, and it's having the tools and techniques that when the stress hits, how do we then manage it? And how do we protect ourselves from chronic stress, you know, and that cumulative effect of stress day in, day out. So it's all about tools and techniques.
Brilliant. Well, I've got to say, I'm really glad, and I'm sure everyone else is, that you didn't follow the geography and that you did to switch over, because I think that you've been a benefit to so many people, and so many more to come as well. And you've also written a stress management course as well, which I'm going to leave some links below.
Great.
And some details on how you can contact Cheryl if you need to. But we're going to pull the podcast up in a short while. But before we go, Cheryl, have you got one last tip for anyone who maybe knows someone who's got stress or is actually feeling a bit stressful themselves?
Oh, okay. Probably to have a look into mindfulness. So a lot of the tools and techniques that I teach, when I look at them and kind of like pull them apart, there's often mindfulness is often at the core. And so mindfulness is one of those funny terms that people sometimes associate with meditation and with all sorts of other stuff. But mindfulness is just very, very simple. And it's about focusing on one thing at once. Now, how difficult is that in today's society, where we're kind of bombarded from dawn till dusk with marketing calls to action, the phone, banging on, and all the things we have to do, which is a lot more than our ancestors, kind of like, 500 years ago. I mean, they had some very immediate stressors, but we're under constant stress. We have a delayed return kind of model. So we work to get paid at the end of the month. It's not so immediate. So we've got constant ongoing kind of stress. And mindfulness is about, the cheesy saying, like coming back to the moment, but it's about focusing on one thing at a time. And so instead of the brain being jumping from this to that to the other, that conversation I had, that thing I've got to do, that this, that, the other, mindfulness is about bringing it back into focusing on one thing. And that can even be mountain bike riding. It could actually be watching a film on the telly, because when we're watching a film, we're totally absorbed in what we're doing. It could be doing the washing up really, consciously, kind of like, oh, that's interesting. I've got a plate. I'm washing it up. This is the temperature of the water.
I've done your stress management course, and one of the things you said, even just concentrate on doing your shoelaces up. Take a moment.
Yeah.
And I do that every time now. I've never even noticed before. It's brilliant.
And it's funny how many things we are doing at once, actually. And if you think about, like, before you've done the course, then, when you were normally doing your shoelaces up, you were probably thinking about where the car keys, where, what time have I got, have I done that? You've just got 100 things going on in your head. And so mindfulness is very much about concentrating. So actually, thinking really sensitive about having a glass of water and just really concentrating on drinking that water, the taste of the water, the temperature of the water, feeling it go down the esophagus into the stomach, imagining what's going to happen with it next. Gosh, that, if the whole world just did that 3, 4, 5 times a day, really concentrated on drinking a glass of water, it just kind of presses reset. It clears the brain, neutralizes our thoughts, and brings us back to a calmer place where we can then, when we think about the next thing, we focus on just that. So, yeah.
That's a really good point. So thanks, Cheryl. I really enjoyed that chat today, and I've found it very useful myself, and I'm hoping that the viewers watching today really enjoyed that as well. But thank you for coming along.
You're so welcome, Paul. Really enjoyed it. Love talking to you. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cheryl. And we'll be putting another podcast together in the very near future, so look out for that, and I hope to see you there. In the meantime, have a great time. Bye.
See you, Paul.